Labor availability is the number one criterion that companies use to decide where they're going to build their factories.
If you cannot hire the local person, you really don't have a choice but to hire for aptitude and train, but that brings with it certain risks because as that person's skills increase due to the training and the experience in your facility, they're also becoming more and more marketable for another job that is in strong demand. So you have to couple that training and aptitude with this very strong retention program. Otherwise, you're really just building a workforce for your competitor.
Welcome to American Made, the show where we discuss the labor issues that are impacting manufacturers today. I'm Michele Vincent, Vice President of Corp.
I'm Joel Zimmerman, President and CEO of Corp.
Today, we're diving into the data and the real reason that your factory can't find the skilled workers that they need. I think that a lot of people today don't recognize how big of an issue the labor shortage really is. I think as a country, we are having labor issues across all industries, but manufacturing in particular faces its own set of unique challenges. So some interesting statistics that I have pulled together that I just want to share with you from Deloitte, I believe, is the U.S. may see as many as 2 million manufacturing jobs go unfilled by 2030. 72% of industrial employers today say they can't find the skills that they need today. There's also data on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce website that breaks down how bad the labor shortage is by state. So if you've not seen that before, I would Google it and go, and you can actually click on your state. And there's a lot of data that you can look at on that website. But the key point that I would point you to is the number of available workers per 100 jobs. So in Wisconsin, I want to say it's probably around 70 available workers for every 100 jobs. But if you go to the Dakotas, it drops down to lower around the 40s. And so when you're thinking about how to attract talent in terms of increasing your pay, adjusting your work rules, and all of the creative things that employers usually do to attract talent, at the end of the day, if the workers aren't there, it's still going to be very, very difficult to find the talent that you need. And then in manufacturing specifically, the issue becomes, manufacturing has been painted as a less than job, right? We've been pushing generations to college and not into the trades and not into manufacturing. And that is partly what has kind of led us to where we are today. But there's a lot of factors beyond that we can talk about.
I think the core contributor to the problem is what you mentioned, is that it's not considered the most respectable career path to go into manufacturing and even into the skilled trades. And what we're dealing with now is decades of pushing people who may not be as well suited or benefit from the college experience away from a more traditional manufacturing environment. And it's going to take a long time to correct that.
Yeah, I think, and there's so many other things too. I think one of the big ones, at least somewhat recently, is the pandemic, right? That really shook up the whole labor market in general. It pushed a lot of people into retirement just because people didn't want to go to work. So just in general, we have an issue of we're not making enough humans. And so as people begin to retire, we just don't have enough people that are, coming into the job market. So one of the older podcast episodes that I did, a topic came up in conversation about this issue. And it's something that I don't typically see out there in articles that I'm reading and in data that I see, but it's definitely very relevant. And it's regarding the addiction issue that we have in this country. And there's a huge portion of working age people who are suffering with addiction. And that is also taking people out of the workforce.
I mean, that's just further pressure on the availability of personnel, whether they're skilled or not, right? So the addiction thing definitely is putting pressure on it. But in general, people need to see this as something to be proud of and something that's beneficial to them and their family, right? And what people are starting to realize is that The quickest way to become a millionaire today is to become a plumber or an electrician and start your own business after you've accumulated the skills, right? You're not starting out $200,000 in debt. You have real practical skills that are not likely to be replaced at any time soon by AI or robotics. So I think there will be an increasing interest in the trades, and the entrepreneurial aspect for some people go into that from a financial aspect. But again, it's not an overnight solution. So the country's facing hundreds of thousands of openings in skilled trade positions, with it getting even more urgent because of some of the changes that are happening in the country today. Well, one of the factors and part of the pressure on bringing business back that isn't, it's not completely silent, but it's not really spoken about a lot, is the national security aspect of it, right? They're doing it for economic reasons. Right? There's a lot of movement right now, the tariffs and everything, but there's a lot of investment coming into the country, and it seems very real and long lasting. And at the end of the day, countries should be able to make their own essential products. You have to be able to make medicine. You have to be able to make vehicles, ships, generate your own power. The dependency of the last few decades, I think, is starting to go away because people realize that the best path to safety is not to be reliant on others, especially others who can have an adversarial posture. And that's one of the things that we saw during the pandemic. Having a threat made that we weren't going to be provided with antibiotics, I think was a wake up call to anybody with a brain. And that applies to everything else that's critical to keeping the country safe and the people healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. That was, I think most people weren't thinking about supply chains before COVID, right? And where their products came from, or there was no worry about where if they could get toilet paper or cleaning products, right? And then as things started shifting and we couldn't get product here, it became a very common word. And where are these things coming from, whether it's raw materials or actual products being made, assembled, and shipped over here. And so from then, companies started planning for, how do we bring more manufacturing back to the US? And, I see it in articles today, the impact that not having the right labor has on just building the new manufacturing plants, right? And companies today are having difficulty staffing their first shift, right? Never mind their third shift. So as these manufacturing plants start to come online, it's going to be even more difficult to find people. And you can't just flip a switch in terms of getting people interested in the trades and getting people to veer away from college, right? That's a long-term thing. There's a PR issue, I've heard people say, in manufacturing, right? We need to figure out how can we make it more attractive? How can we make children excited about it from a young age and then want to get into that as they get older? We need to have the right training in place. But all of these things are not overnight solutions. These are things that companies and people in the industry that are passionate about it really need to be planning for and thinking about now for long-term solutions. But companies today also need short-term solutions, and that can be very tricky.
I think especially today and for the foreseeable future. And I think that's why there's some chatter out in the news cycle about allowing some of these countries and companies from around the world to bring their own personnel in to help get their plants finalized and up and running. And I think that's a necessary reality if we can't staff it internally right now from a skill set standpoint. And that's the short term solution, not the most desirable one, but it should be considered a transitional period. And hopefully the interest domestically will shift and people will start to train up into these very available jobs that are going to be very well paid.
Yeah, and I think we're at an interesting point right now, um, with the economy and everything that's going on in the world, geopolitical issues and things like that. Companies don't seem to be taking big steps. There's not the hiring frenzy or I need labor now mentality that we saw during COVID. There was a period during that time where every single call that I got from companies across the country was, I need 50 people right now. It was the weirdest thing because it was 50 was the number every single time. And it was just how quickly can you get them to me? I don't necessarily see a quick shift in that all of a sudden, but I do think it's gonna gradually increase, and there's gonna be that pressure. Um, Not sure when it's gonna kind of accelerate, but I know it's coming. I can feel it a little bit. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Totally. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy right now, which I think is slowing down some of those decisions. But at the end of the day, the need is going to surface sooner than later, and people are going to have to figure out what they're going to do. And that creates a lot of opportunity for people interested in traveling and move their skill set around. But again, short term solution. And you need to get people into programs, much like what Mike Rowe was talking about. Get people excited about, get people into apprenticeship programs, and let's rebuild the workforce that we're going to need to be a self-sufficient country.
I think now, before the crazy pressure starts, it would probably be advantageous for companies to start thinking about having staffing contingency plans. Where am I gonna find the workers if all of a sudden I need to ramp up production, right? I mean, I feel like we're kind of seeing it a little bit in the market already because we are getting phone calls from companies that are planning a couple months out. If we can't find the workers, can you help us get them kind of situations, right? And I think initially more recently, that was around the whole tariff issue, right? Because when things were kind of up in the air at first about that, companies were planning, do I need to bring production back here and doing all that. But I just think it's a good business practice, right? And I a lot of companies don't even really understand that a traveling manufacturing workforce exists. Any person who's worked in a unionized company understands of that business model from strike planning and strike staffing. But there's so many people throughout the country that have never worked in a union plant and don't even realize that a service like that exists, right? I would think if you ask those individuals about how to get workers from outside of the area, they might instinctively think you can bring them in from other countries. But with that, there's a whole added layer that seems very difficult. I've never participated in it, so I can't speak to it with certainty, but I've talked with companies who use it, right? And so you have to be able to prove that you can't hire the workers. You have to be ready for audits. There's some sort of a cap limit, so they only issue a certain amount. I think it's the H2B visa. There's a cap limit, so there's only a certain amount of visas that are allowed per year. I think it's like first half of the year, second half of the year. Don't quote me on that. I'm not an expert. But essentially, there's like a lottery. So if you're looking for workers, you might have to go into a lottery. So then there's additional uncertainty. Are you even going to be able to get the workers? Then you got to bring them in from out of the country. And then you have to make sure that you pay them a minimum wage. And if you're not and you're being sneaky, you could get an audit and get in trouble. And it just seems, I mean, I get it. A lot of industries outside of manufacturing use that, but manufacturers use it as well. But you can do it within the country. It's less of a difficult process, and also they're all U.S. citizens. So if you're talking any sort of a business with any sort of an ITAR facility, if you need U.S. citizens, I mean, that's a good solution. And that in aerospace and defense right now, there's a lot of money going into that, right, for defense reasons. And so those companies right now really do need solutions for how can I be certain that I have the right skill set in place? How can I be certain that I have enough workers to meet the demands of production? I think a good example of this maybe, Boeing decided that they were going to increase production of one of their planes, 757 maybe. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's what it was. So when they all of a sudden decide that they're going to do that, there's a whole trickle-down effect, right? They need all of their stuff to make their
Whole
planes.
supply chain
So
leaks
the
up.
whole supply chain needs to be able to accommodate that. And so when they made that announcement, or probably way before they made that announcement, right, now they have to go out to their suppliers and make sure, are you going to be able to get me my parts? If you're not going to be able to get me my parts, where am I going to get them? And then that's a whole thing in itself.
Which we have experience with from the past. And, one of the fun things we've done is we helped a very large client make sure that they were getting a steady supply of parts by putting personnel into the companies that were, in their supply chain.
Actually, I'm glad that you brought that up because that is a unique differentiator and a unique service, right? So if you go with a traditional staffing agency that provides you with local people, that's one thing. If you were to use a company like us that sources talent all across the country and then relocates workers, from a supply chain management perspective, if you are having a supply chain issue across multiple vendors that's impacting your production, you can use us or a company like us to go out there and make sure that every single facility that you have a backlog at, in fact, it doesn't matter if you're in the Dakotas or in Wisconsin or whatever state doesn't have enough workers for the jobs that there are, you can guarantee that that plant's going to get the people that they need with the skill sets that can acclimate quickly, ramp up that production, and fix that backlog.
Completely. And that's one of the things that is not common knowledge, is that you can have the most perfectly staffed plant, whether internal or through temporary personnel. But if you're not getting parts, you're not going to be productive.
Right.
So you have to look beyond the walls of the factory and look at, how is my supply chain going to react to this increased productivity we're about to switch on?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's again, I think, something that most people aren't thinking about or even aware that you can solve your labor issues, and supply chain issues. Yeah, no, it's not, but it's nice because, then you have one company, sort of one team that is overseeing the staffing at your suppliers, regardless of where they are. They could be in 9 different states, right? And then you have that sort of cohesive team with the knowledge of everything that's going on. And I would imagine, I'm on the other side of the table, but if I would imagine from the employer's perspective that's looking to solve that problem, much easier than dealing with 9 different staffing agencies in 9 different states and trying to make sure that everything is happening as it should be.
Or just putting pressure onto your suppliers and trying to will them to make a solution. Sometimes you have to give them the solution.
Yeah, you do. And then it can be sort of a team effort, right? Between your supply chain managers and the leadership team at the supplier so that everything is going as smoothly as possible.
Right. And the same benefit extends to the supply chain. If they have an immediate need that they have to meet and they don't have the personnel, it's a temporary solution while they hire their own permanent employees. And again, you can use the temporary personnel to train the permanents. So at Maticorp, we do not just send warm bodies. We send fully vetted, skilled trades personnel, including welders, machinists, maintenance techs, electrical techs, and everything else, every other role you can imagine within the production environment. If you need a fast solution that's reliable and consistent, please visit maticorp.com and be happy to provide a quote.
So on an old podcast episode, I talked to Harry Moser. He is the founder of the Reshoring Initiative. So he collects a lot of data and works with companies on their reshoring efforts. And what he told me, and it makes sense, is that labor availability is the number one criterion that companies use to decide where they're going to build their factories, which makes sense in this labor market. But some of the other issues that come from that, I mean, even especially some of these large manufacturing plants, right? Or even distribution centers that are being built by Amazon, whatever it is, they go into an area because there's a lot of labor. That's great. They think they're going to staff their plants, and they are. But then you're going to have a whole group of companies around that area that are maybe less well known that are now concerned they're going to lose their employees to the new plant or the new distribution center that's being built. Circling back again to the contingency planning effort, we have talked with companies in those positions where that's a big concern of theirs. They need a staffing plan in the event that that happens, right? Because they have to get their product out. They have to, whether it's a warehouse or a manufacturing plant, they need to have a plan. And, again, with limited labor, it's going to be a huge issue. I don't see any of this going away anytime soon.
There are solutions for those who want to go down the path of a temporary worker presence in the facility, but there's a cost associated with that. And a lot of times the the company may need to go through a process, which the initial reaction is that's rather expensive compared to a regular employee. And we're going to hire a new agency. We're going to do this. We're going to get a new recruiting manager, whatever. And a lot of it is wishful thinking rather than planning for the worst case scenario. Right. So they need to get to the point where we're still going to make money, not quite as much, but we're going to be fulfilling our commitments to our customers.
Right.
Right. While we solve our problem, which is going to take some time.
Yeah, because depending upon the industry that you're working in, if you don't get your product to your customer on time, there could be costly penalties for that.
There will be a lot of that. And on a more ground level, you don't want to lose market share and you don't want to lose shelf space.
Right. So I think being able to have a plan, being able to, like you said, continue your operations, even if you're not making as much money, that's going to be a huge differentiator, right? If you have a solid plan in place and you can get those people that you need when you need them, that's the best thing that you could do in terms of being proactive and making sure that, like you said, you plan for the worst case scenario and hope for the best, as we used to say back in the day. But it's a good business practice to do it that way.
It's a great time to have those skill sets too, because the demand is going to increase and it's going to increase rapidly, and they're going to benefit from that while the shortage remains a factor. But I also think it's going to draw a lot more people into the area because of the money and also the stability and the long-term benefit as well as a patriotic pride in helping the country.
Yeah. And I think in terms of, having a contingency plan in place for that, what does that look like, right? Some people might not really have an idea, but you need to figure out, worst case scenario, how many people do I need? What are the categories, et cetera. And then figure out where you're going to get them, whether or not it's a company like us or another place or a visa program, whatever that is. But you want to make sure that you open those lines of communication, ideally before you need them, right? Because the worst position you could be in is scrambling and trying to rush through something. So have those conversations, identify, does the agency you're talking with, are they able to get you the people that you're looking for? What's the time frame that they can typically get them for you in? Just to kind of give our audience an idea, I would say generally, there's a short duration window that it takes us to get people to a project site. But if it gets crazy like in COVID, then in the demand for traveling workers increases, those timelines could increase, right? And so maintaining conversation with a company about that and just understanding, is it harder right now to get me maintenance techs and machinists? Is it, where are you at? And just making sure that you understand potential timeframes to get people on site. I think that's important. And like I said, that can fluctuate depending upon what's going on in the market.
As well as being realistic about the availability of a qualified workforce in the area and be realistic about what local temp solutions are going to produce for you. You probably remember we were called upon by a entity in the cosmetics space that had an acquisition, and they did our bread and butter, which is I need an entire shift of over 100 people. And when we got there, we learned that they had a local temp staffing agency that was engaged on a daily basis to bring people into the plant. But they didn't go to them for that because their expectations had gotten to the point where the turnover and the absenteeism and the craziness from the local, very affordable temp agency was tolerated. So you have people who show up for 3 days, disappear for a week, and were allowed back in, right? Not to mention some other behaviors on the property, which were undesirable from a legality standpoint. So they knew that we're going to suffer through this on a daily basis because we're getting the job done. Now we have an immediate need and we need an immediate solution, right? So there's a very strong difference between the people available locally in the facility where the buy-in is not the same as it is with people who do travel work for a living, and the barrier to exit is very low. Because if they're not happy, they quit and they go down the street to the next temp agency and they're working at the factory right next door. Our personnel, unlike with a temp agency, develop a relationship, and most anybody who's providing a professional staffing service should have that. They don't work for the client, so there isn't a strong bond there, but they do work for us. And because you, if you're smart about it, you track their performance. You reward the ones that perform well, and you slow down deployment on someone who's not performing so well. And one of the most valuable things about um, providing quality service to your client is not to allow people who should not be rehired to be rehired, even if it's convenient. You have to continually increase the quality of your own workforce to benefit the client because that's not what they're used to. And because that's not what they're used to, even if they have some temporary experience, their baseline is not commensurate to what is available to them when there's a significant and rapid need that's on set.
Do you think you should hire for aptitude and train or only hire fully skilled?
I think that's a function of every individual situation. If you have an immediate need and you can hire a very experienced, skilled person that doesn't require training, clearly that's the way to go as long as it is affordable. If you cannot hire the local person, you really don't have a choice but to hire for aptitude and train, but that brings with it certain risks because as that person's skills increase due to the training and the experience in your facility, they're also becoming more and more marketable for another job that is in strong demand. So you have to couple that training and aptitude with a very strong retention program. Otherwise, you're really just building a workforce for your competitor.
Let's keep the conversation going on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me or Joel and share your thoughts, your insights, or even suggestions for a next podcast episode. Let's jump into our Love It and Hate It segment. Let's start with this. Reshoring is pointless without a long-term training pipeline. I hate it.
I love it.
Why do you love it?
I love it because there is no long-term training pipeline and creates great opportunity for us.
Fair. I hate it. I don't think you need to have a long-term training pipeline to take the steps to reshore. Yes, you should have one, but it's absolutely necessary. I think you should jump right in and figure it out later. All right, next one. On-site daycare is worth the cost. I think so. So an older podcast interview I did was with one of the HR business partners from Hormel Foods, and they were building a childcare facility next to, I believe it was their corporate office and their largest manufacturing plant. As a mother of 4 children myself, I have had to juggle my career and my children, and childcare is so big and so necessary, as is, kudos to you, a very great boss who is flexible and understanding. But when it comes to manufacturing, you can't have that same flexibility, right? And so having that on-site daycare, if you're looking to tap into different types of humans, right, than you're traditionally hiring, you need to be creative. And I think having a childcare facility on site is going to just open up people who would not otherwise be available for work.
I agree with that, especially, given the shortage of personnel, anything you can do to make it easier to take a job and be a great employee is going to help ease that burden. And it doesn't mean you have to go in Silicon Valley with a massage and a latte and whatever to entice people. But if you do give them the ability to ease their life burden, have their kids nearby in a qualified daycare facility, and make it less stressful just to get through the day-to-day life, you're going to attract more personnel and you're going to keep them longer.
Focusing on frontline leader development is essential. Weak leadership is causing turnover. Love it and hate it. I think, yes, that leadership can absolutely cause turnover. So you should honestly always be looking to develop your leaders and your employees and making them better. But I think there's a lot of other contributing factors that can cause turnover. But that is a big one, right? If you have employees who are having a bad experience with their boss, they're going to go home, they're going to sit down at dinner, and they're going to start complaining about that stuff, right? Like that has a big impact on your work life and whether or not you want to run for the hills.
It's true. Reason I love it is frontline leadership sets the tone and it sets the culture for the shift, right? So they will steer your employees as a leader into satisfaction and happiness or not so much. But that has to be earned respect. So if you're developing them, your frontline leadership from the ranks of the workforce, it shows the rest of them there's a pathway onward and upward. It builds in the respect from the workers because the person knows how to do the job and actually has experience in the job. And as long as that person's demeanor and personality is conducive to a good work environment, you're gonna foster the best possible experience for everyone in the plant, which lowers your turnover, increases your productivity.
On our next episode, we'll discuss why contract labor is no longer a dirty word. Before then, let's jump into a quick summary.
So we've just unpacked the data behind the factory labor crisis. And remember, without people, there is no production. Until the next time.